Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to the last day of the Public Forum, and welcome to our session titled Decarbonization of Energy-Intensive Metal Sectors and Global Trade. We especially thank you for being with us today at this very early hour. It's much appreciated. As we all know, hard-to-abate industries are the biggest carbon emission contributors, which makes them a priority on the path to decarbonization. However, decarbonizing these energy-intensive sectors remain challenging. As demand for these sectors continue to increase parallel to global economic growth and rising population, our need for international cooperation and commitment within and across borders becomes ever more important. Over the next hour or so, we are going to be exploring with our very esteemed distinguished panel members three main issues. First, we will reflect on barriers and explore solutions to reduce carbon emissions. Secondly, we will look at how geopolitical tensions and protectionist trade measures and policies are slowing down decarbonization efforts. Third and last, we will discuss how trade and international cooperation can help us to get back on track with our zero emission targets. Before introducing our esteemed panelists, I would like to recall that this session is organized by Istanbul Mineral and Metals Exporters Association, which is in short we call IMMIB. It's an umbrella organization to its 70,000 member companies, and acts as an interface between these companies and the government, aiming to improve their export potential through a wide array of export promotion activities and research. I would like to thank them for organizing this meeting and being with us here in this room today. And today IMMIB brought with us very distinguished panel members in the field of, they're experts in the field of aluminium and steel, and they represent different regions and perspectives. Now let me introduce them. To my immediate right, we have Mr. Zaid Aljanabi. He's currently a principal analyst at the CRU, covering all aspects of the aluminium value chain. In his right, we have Yavuz Arkun. He is currently working as strategy and marketing director in ASSAN Alüminyum, which is one of the biggest manufacturers in Turkey. He's responsible from, among others, strategic planning and sustainability issues. On his right, we have Chrysa Glystra. She's currently working as Trade and Economics Policy Manager in UK Steel, which is a trade association representing UK's steel manufacturers. And lastly, but not the least, we have Bülent Hacıoğlu. He's a partner at Trade Resources Company, and he's the managing director of company's Istanbul office. He advises clients for a range of issues ranging from trade policy and trade remedy investigations in particular. After this introduction, without further ado, I would like to kick off our discussion and turn to Zaid first to get us started. Zaid, aluminium is both an important input to many technologies and critical to many technologies that are critical to our energy transition, and at the same time, however, a significant contributor to carbon emissions. Based on your extensive experience on the sector, could you frame us the global aluminium industry in the context of decarbonization? What are the challenges and opportunities to decarbonize? And we also know that geopolitical factors have been playing a major role in shaping and remapping global trade flows. How has this impacted the aluminium industry, and how do they relate to decarbonization?
Thank you very much, Ms. Yerdesh, and thank you very much for the invitation here for the WTO Public Forum. Maybe before I go into that question, I would like to frame maybe the historical context of the birth of the aluminium industry, okay, particularly for people who are not familiar with this industry. Aluminium is a fairly modern industry, okay, in comparison to the other metals and mining sector, and And the strong evidence in there, if you go to any museum, you're not going to find an ancient artifact made out of aluminium. And that's because it was started actually being produced in the mid-19th century and began to be introduced on a large industrial scale towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Now, how does that relate to our topic? I think it does relate very closely to our topic and the challenges of the aluminium industry. And that is because of the chemistry of the main raw material for aluminium, which is alumina, aluminium oxide. The tenacity of that molecule requires a very energy-intensive industry, or it's very energy-intensive in order to separate that and create aluminium. So the reason why we have a modern aluminium industry, okay, is actually coincided with effectively the birth of the power station. Okay, so that is, I think, this is very relevant now. So as that process, which is called the whole ERU process, was born actually in the United States and in France, gradually over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen, let's say, the areas where aluminium effectively was, or primary aluminium smelting was closer to where the demand is, mainly US and Western Europe, started moving more eastwards, okay, due to the availability of cheap power. Okay, so that is a main contributor, let's say, to the production of aluminium. Now, to put that all in context, the source of power, okay, or that feeds the electrolysis process, is the main contributor to the emissions in the aluminium industry, primary aluminium industry. Just to give you examples of some numbers. Globally, on average, if we look at, for instance, the steel industry, for instance, okay, I mean, on average, probably like about 2 tons per ton of steel or crude steel produced, maybe, something like that. Whilst actually, when we talk about the aluminium, on average, it ranges anywhere between 4 and 17. That is 4 and 17 tons of carbon dioxide emitted per ton of aluminium produced. And again, that is due to the energy intensity. So that is actually the main challenge of I would say, of the aluminium industry, is actually the decarbonization of the sources of power. And then after that, the direct emissions, which are the process-related emissions, also they need to be decarbonized through technological investments into new technologies and zero technologies. But then that would be irrelevant if the source of power remains to be coal or something that is actually emissions intensive. Maybe I can illustrate it with one of the charts in here, just to so for example in here, I mean, when we talk about emissions intensity, this is the aluminium value chain effectively. You start with bauxite mining, or effectively bauxite quarrying. It's very low. It's shallow, normally open pit. So that's not energy intensive and not emissions intensive. Then you refine it to alumina, and that is the key element in there. Alumina is effectively aluminium oxide. To smelt aluminium oxide, okay, into aluminium, or primary aluminium as we call it, I mean, you require actually a lot of energy, as you could see, and that is a fairly energy intensive process. I mean, on average, this is the global weighted average of above about 10.6 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of aluminium produced. Now, if you look at this, this is what we call the emissions curve, and this is if we include, this is effectively every smelter in the world, and it's divided by region, and you could probably already started to figure out 3 distinct regions on this chart, and those are effectively related to the sources of power that are required to feed that particular smelter. So you can see at the high end there, okay, which is mainly China and India, and it's effectively coal-fired power stations that feed into that, hence the most energy intensive. The middle bit there, which is primarily the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, that is gas, okay, which is less emissions intensive, around about 7.3 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of aluminium produced. And then the lower end in there, which you can see is quite limited, and that is the hydropowered, and this is primarily Yunnan province in China, Canada, Norway, Russia. Now that brings us probably closely to the second part of your question, which is about the geopolitical and trade challenges. Now, if somebody actually would look at that, okay, let's say if you are a producer, a seller of that metal, or if you're a buyer, hence you work like on a strategic procurement or strategic marketing, okay? You would look at this particular chart, and if you look at the lower end of the aluminium emissions curve, which is around the magic number of 4 tons, the options are quite limited. Okay? There isn't much actually capacity available. A lot of it is actually locked up in long-term contracts. Some of them currently pose geopolitical risks, particularly in the case of Russia, where we've been seeing self-sanctioning taking place with some of the consumers. And a lot of these also rely on hydropower stations, which already existed. And as we know, like hydropower is very capital intensive and kind of requires long-term investments and not available, of course, in any geography. So this is kind of, I would say, the main challenge of decarbonization for the primary aluminum industry. However, there are opportunities as well, I mean, that are associated with it. There's been increasing need for recycling. Of course, as we mentioned, that the energy intensity of aluminium requires effectively something around 13 to 14 megawatts hour, okay, which is huge, to produce 1 ton of aluminium. That is, cannot, for example, a battery cannot do that for you, okay, because it's just there isn't enough capacity. However, blending, okay, that we've been seeing that happening most recently, particularly with solar power, with some of the producers in the Middle East or in the GCC, and also in China, we're utilizing, for example, wind and solar power. But that is actually via blending the source, where you connect. A lot of these smelters effectively have their own captive power stations, because that's what makes them cost competitive as well, and that's what the reason probably they were built in the first place. You blend it like about 10, 15%, something like that, but you can never rely on it 100%. So these are, I would say, kind of a summary of the challenges of aluminium.
Thank you, Zaid, for that. Now I would like to turn to Chrysa. You are coming from a trade association representing UK steel manufacturers, and we know that the carbonization pathways significantly differ from region to region and at company level for steel. But in general, in your experience, what are the challenges for the decarbonization of the steel sector?
Thank you for the question, and also thank you to IMMIB for inviting me here. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. So, I mean, what we've just heard, obviously, from aluminium, a lot of similarities in terms of steel. Steel is also a highly energy-intensive industry, also a very trade-intensive industry. About half of the steel that gets produced around the world crosses borders, and if you exclude China, it's even more than that. So, highly trade-intensive industry, and at the same time, it's considered a strategic industry by many countries. And I guess those two things can cause some tensions, particularly at a time of change like we are undergoing now, where the steel sector is being called upon to decarbonize. I mean, it's not an understatement to say it's probably the biggest transformation the sector has gone through in over 100 years. So it is really a considerable change in terms of how companies operate, the business models, and also the kind of international context, obviously, that this is happening is also important. There's a number of kind of challenges that are specific to decarbonization. Just to go through a few of them, I mean, the first one I'd say is just the size of investment. It's huge. I mean, it's a hugely capital-intensive process, steelmaking anyway. To transform that requires a sizable investment as well, and the way that's being approached or sort of handled in most countries is through a partnership between industry and governments to match fund basically this kind of transition. There's also, in terms of technological innovation, I mean, to an extent, the main way in which the steel sector is decarbonizing, or rather the kind of lower carbon intensive process, is to use scrap steel, recycle the steel through an electric arc furnace. And that considerably reduces emissions and moves us towards a circular model. And that's not a new technology, it's been around for 100 years. However, I guess that will help reduce emissions. It won't get us entirely to net zero, so there's definitely scope for some innovation in terms of use of hydrogen, for example, in steel making, or also even in terms of making the most out of the scrap resource. So basically, scrap, as you'll know, it's all sorts of things mixed together that then has to be processed, separated. Residual elements that contaminate basically this kind of raw material have to be removed, and then that's the way to make the widest range of grades, of steel grades possible. So there's definitely more to be done on that kind of raw materials side of thing as well. Of course, I couldn't not mention energy, and obviously it's been mentioned very much like aluminium. Also for steel, energy costs are such a major part of the cost of production, and it's also a key factor to being competitive. And so by the transition to electric arc furnaces, that is actually even additionally more electro-intensive, and therefore again that point of electricity costs. So obviously there's the capex kind of side in terms of the initial investment, but in terms of the operating costs and remaining competitive, electricity is one of the most important factors. And obviously I'm kind of representing the UK producers. In the UK, this for us is a really long-standing structural issue. Our industrial electricity prices are much higher than, well, most of the world in fact, but particularly much higher than even our neighbouring competitors. So we can pay up to 50% more for our electricity prices than like Germany and France even. So that's a considerable inhibiting factor in that, in our competitiveness, and particularly, as I said, in that kind of time of transition to electric arc furnaces. The other thing that's worth kind of mentioning in terms of decarbonisation is also, which is a challenge, is the different pace of decarbonisation in different parts of the world. And again, taking it back to competitiveness, that is a problem, because obviously decarbonisation is costly. When you're moving faster than others, obviously you put yourself at a disadvantage. And so there is a need for carbon leakage mitigation measures in order for, well, basically, you're putting all that investment in decarbonising your sector. You don't want to then lose the sector, to put it bluntly. So both the EU and the UK are moving forward with carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which will, the premise is domestic producers have to pay for the carbon they emit. A lot of the importers, a lot of the imports don't face those costs, so it's about that levelling that playing field. And then finally, again, kind of you'll notice there's a theme of sort of the challenges of decarbonisation with also remaining competitive. There is this kind of wider context of rising, expanding capacity globally, and actually a lot of capacity additions, steelmaking capacity additions that don't necessarily match increases in domestic demand in some of these countries. So particularly we're seeing this in Southeast Asia, but also in the Middle East. There's a lot of new capacity coming in. And I should clarify here, I'm kind of talking differently about replacement capacity, so something that will replace an existing blast furnace facility, for example, which is the more polluting, more carbon intensive, with an electric arc furnace, versus kind of the net expansion. So we are seeing a lot of expansion. At the same time, I mean, we can't talk about steel without talking about China, of course, because China produces and consumes more than half the world's steel. So what happens in China has a lot of spillover effects. So we're seeing weakening demand in China, a lot of new capacity, a lot of oversupply, and that is a challenge. That's creating import pressures. It's more kind of generally a challenge, but kind of more, it directly relates to decarbonisation as well. So a lot of these capacity expansions I've spoken about are actually in blast furnace operations. And as I said, a lot of it is in Southeast Asia. So in Asia, the capacity additions that are blast furnaces represent 74%. So we're still talking about a lot of investment in this more carbon-intensive technology, which locks in that production for at least 30 years. And so, at a time when we are trying to invest and decarbonize when you're seeing all that investment elsewhere, that it's in more carbon-intensive technologies, it's counterproductive in terms of obviously the decarbonization objective, but also it creates that competitiveness issue where we're seeing a lot of kind of high emission imports coming into our markets. And then, as I said already, obviously it damages or it undermines also the ability to invest when you have that kind of import pressure on the margins and the profitability of the sector. And ultimately, if we are if we're in an oversupplied market, we're producing more than we need, and therefore we're emitting more than we need. So again, it's kind of counterproductive. And a lot of that kind of capacity is subsidized. It's not kind of responding to market signals in the same ways that it is in other parts of the world. And so, it's a sticky situation, if you like, where we have this kind of structural issue that is damaging the industry and kind of undermining the decarbonization. So I guess we do see a considerable or an important role for policy to create that framework to enable us to decarbonize, but also remain competitive at the same time.
Thank you, Chrysa, for that. And now I would like to move to Yavuz Bey. Your company is one of the important aluminium manufacturers in Turkey, and sustainability issues lies at the core of your company's operations. Can you tell us a bit on ASSAN Alüminyum's strategy to reduce carbon emissions? That will be good. After the overview of the both sectors, we would like to hear some more practical, from the ground experience from you.
Of course. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this public forum. I would like, ideally, I would like to be original and explain new things, innovative things, but both in the sectoral roadmaps and in our own roadmap, the main things that needs to be done are very clear. Over 95% of our product carbon footprint comes from the primary aluminium that we use, and essentially we need to replace that relatively high carbon aluminium, primary aluminium, with both lower carbon primary over time and also with scrap aluminium. Now, still we are lucky in that we have a material that is infinitely recyclable. So the main issue for ASSAN Alüminyum and the aluminium industry is having access to suitable scrap and having access to low carbon primary. And we will publish our own roadmap very soon, one of these days, in a few days. And there we are aiming to reach 7 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030 and 3 by 2035. And the way we do it is by using more low carbon primary, more scrap, and after 2035, in order to go to net zero by 2050, we will need to replace our furnaces, for example, that use natural gas with electricity, the ones that use electricity. To support this whole roadmap, we are planning to invest in renewable energy production. We already have our own hydroelectric power plant. We recently acquired a solar power plant as well, and we will continue to do that. And we also have recycling facilities which we will invest more in the future. And in parallel with this, still this all requires a lot of money, a lot of capital, and on our part, and even more on part of smelters who produce carbon, who should be producing low carbon aluminium for our plant to succeed. But most importantly, we need to work with our customers because the products that have low carbon are not one-to-one replacements of our existing products.
Okay, thank you very much. So let us now, in our second round, explore a bit on trade policy. Chrysa already pointed out the link between trade and decarbonization in a very eloquent way, so I would like to again turn to Zaid. Could you describe us trade policies in the US and Europe and elsewhere and their impact on aluminium?
Yeah, of course. I mean, probably like just before that, maybe like trade policies effectively and decarbonization, and of course the topic of this session, have the power of remapping the trade routes or existing trade routes. So if we look, maybe take a step back a little bit and see, maybe portray the picture of how it is currently and how it might, basically what's the shape of it is going to be in the future. So if you visualize the aluminium trade routes in the aluminium industry, you have like kind of particularly three major deficit areas, hence net importers. And these are effectively the US, Western Europe, and Japan. Historically, they used to have high production, they used to be quite balanced, but then because of the cheaper power and the power intensity throughout kind of, let's say, the last 25 years has been shifting gradually towards the east, particularly China. China at the beginning of the millennium was about 9% of global production, currently is around 60% of global production. So it's a massive increase. The same thing actually with the GCC countries, mainly because of cheaper power and availability of power. So if you look at the areas where you have net surplus, okay, or net export, where the metal flows into these net deficit areas mainly, of course there are many other trade routes, but effectively Russia is a net exporter, the GCC is a net exporter, and Canada is a net exporter, Norway is a net exporter to all these, mainly to all these regions effectively. So this is actually the picture as it is, where kind of metal flows as such. And of course, I mean, the focus primarily when you are selling into these very mature markets are effectively quality. Okay, so I mean, the focus has been on the quality, on the value-added products, what we call them, and so forth. Indeed, I mean, policies would maybe, like for example, we mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM in Europe. I mean, this is a new policy because it's an environmental policy and a trade policy blended into one. So it's kind of a first of its kind. Okay, there isn't something that we can compare it with. Okay, and this is one of the challenges of that. But we can, well, analysts, this is what they do all the time, is actually just draw up scenarios. Okay, what happens if this happens and what happens if that happens? So in the case of CBAM, effectively, because Europe is indeed is a net importer, and one of the major net exporters into Western Europe, of course, was Russia. Okay, and this has become, that trade route has been kind of, let's say, shifted more towards the east because of global factors. That means effectively the costs, I mean, we've been estimating the cost of CBAM will add to the consumers within Europe. So now you get, like for example, you get metal from the GCC coming over, you get metal from India coming over, but we're talking about carbon and natural gas-based aluminium, effectively. Okay, so indeed that will add to the costs. Of course, I think the UK, I mean, it's not a major player in the global aluminium industry, but also trying to implement something, CBAM-style policy as well. Again, I mean, the UK, when I started in the industry, we used to have, I think, 3 smelters. Now we're down to the smallest smelter in Europe remaining only. So this is, of course, I mean, you see the gradually, you know, kind of like, let's say, the decline and the shift of British aluminium industry from primary sector and focusing mostly on the secondary sector, or secondary aluminium as we call it, which is, other word for it is recycled metal or scrap. I mean, in the US, indeed, I mean, you have policies effectively encouraging the greening of the economy. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, effectively, heavy investments, particularly on green technology. And I think probably that brings it over. I mean, we'll be focusing a lot on the energy intensity of aluminium and the emissions intensity of aluminium. I think there are also opportunities, in particular, to all these policies that promote energy transition. Because aluminium, since the birth of that industry, let's say, has managed to gain a lot of market share, new markets, in comparison to other metal because of the nature of the metal or because of the chemistry of the metal itself. So for instance, I mean, when we're talking about energy transition, I mean, one of the things that is required for energy transition is, of course, like overhead conductors, for instance, okay? The ones that we see like for power transmission. Those are entirely made out of aluminium. And you actually need primary aluminium for that. There's no option for recycled metal because of conductivity issues. So that's one option. The other option is, of course, like lightweighting. So developing new alloys to lightweight the vehicles to make it a stronger vehicle. But again, the lighter the vehicle, the less energy it will consume. Hence, that's the benefit, of course, of the aluminium industry, and has been gaining a lot of market share from other metals, from steel and so forth, for the automotive body sheet. And even actually in the manufacturing of the battery itself, there's a new market called aluminium foil, battery foil. And it's a very small niche industry, okay, but this is actually the fastest segment within the aluminium sector. But it is actually a proof that the aluminium industry has been always able to kind of gain newer markets throughout its history. Again, I mean, maybe we can add other areas, other parts of the world. I mean, indeed, China historically has been discouraging the exports of energy-intensive metals, particularly primary aluminium. And this is not something new, and it wasn't necessarily for environmental purposes. So that was like, for example, where you had the export duty on primary aluminium, because China, indeed, when they didn't want to export, for instance, energy-intensive metal like primary aluminium, but they were encouraging more kind of the downstream sector, hence the processing, the less energy-intensive part of it, and potentially the more value-added part of it, where you could get, for example, like, let's say, export rebate. But again, because you link that to the energy, potentially that can be seen as kind of, let's say, environmental trade policy.
Thank you, Zaid, for that. And now Yavuz Bey, Zaid already mentioned about the CBAM. Turkey is yet to set up its own emission trading system, as we all know. In the meantime, carbon border adjustment measure of the EU has kicked in, although it's in the reporting stage right now. But EU is your major export destination. So could you tell us about the green policies that have most immediate impact on companies like yours, and your practical experience on the first stage of CBAM? How did it go thus far?
Yes, thank you very much. First, I will try to curb my enthusiasm for talking about CBAM and its many faults. For your sake.
We are very enthusiastic to talk about it in this.
So consider this a very short summary. Like you mentioned, Europe, especially Western Europe, is our main export market, and we were the fastest growing company in our field over the last 20 or more years. The basis for that is being able to be the preferred suppliers of our customers. So it's not price. We are price competitive, but we are not price oriented. We are service and quality oriented, and that's how we managed to grow our market share. First of all, CBAM singles out exporters and creates additional bureaucratic hoops that our customers need to jump through in order to use our products. And that creates a fundamental imbalance or injustice in our views. Compared to domestic, buying from a domestic producer, it is just much more burdensome now to buy from a company like ASSAN Alüminyum, even though we are in the customs union with European Union. And the CBAM regulation in particular was designed by a very small team, a few people, over a very short period of time for such historic regulation, first of its kind in human history. And this team might deserve some praise for doing as good a job as they did. But at the end, the European Commission, Council, Member States and Parliament shouldn't have allowed such an important regulation done in such a rushed manner. And right now we are in the middle of the transitional period until beginning of 2026. And this, the regulation governing this period was published at the last minute. And even when the reporting requirements started, it wasn't clear who would be managing the reporting in the individual countries, the national authorities, what the basis of many of the details, detailed calculations were, and so on. And for example, in our case, we were the reporting, and the company that had to do the reporting in a very select few cases, and we were unable to do that, even though we had the data prepared and willing and able to do so, because the legislation, the regulation did not foresee the specific case that we were in. And it was, we were not allowed to do the reporting ourselves as non-EU, as a non-EU company. We had to find an indirect customs representative, but there was literally no company willing to take on this reporting because of its novelty and uncertainties for the people who were, or the companies who were going to do the reporting. Nobody wanted to take this risk. So for several quarters we were unable to report, to do the reporting. And now the importers and exporters to the EU have our own list of problems. And on the other hand, the European producers also have problems. Aluminium industry did not see the CBAM as the appropriate tool to address carbon leakage, and still doesn't. Because of the importance of indirect emissions for aluminium industry and the problems they see with CBAM in that area. That's the main reason. But there are other issues they bring up. So essentially we have a regulation that is novel, and it is not seen as a good solution in its present state for any party, any stakeholder. And I'm afraid it will be even worse when it comes to the definitive period, because then it will also have a financial impact. And I'm afraid we will live through the same problems starting 2026, only more so.
Thank you, Yavuz Bey. Now I would like to turn to Chrysa from a different angle. Chrysa, right after UK's Brexit, UK introduced its own standalone ETS in 2021, and the UK government is considering to start its own CBAM by 2027. as the free allowances will phase out gradually in the UK, the issue of leveling the playing field and the risk of carbon leakage will become ever more important, as you have already pointed out, the pressure from imports. And we also know that Yavuz Bey mentioned about the situation of CBAM, that it was rushed and the transition period maybe had its own problems. In UK's case, there will be no transition period as well. We also know that. So I would like to ask you how, in your view, in general, I'm asking this, rising protectionism impacts decarbonization of steel sector, and from your perspective, what's the role of CBAM in the decarbonization of the steel industry, and what are the trade implications? And Yavuz Bey said that for aluminium, CBAM was not the appropriate tool, but according to steel, from the perspective of steel, is that seen as an appropriate tool in the UK? Thank you.
So let me start by saying that I completely kind of empathise with kind of what you have just described, because obviously we're looking to implement our own CBAM, but in the meantime we also export to the EU, and we're also faced with exactly those same challenges. And so I guess we're in a position where we can hopefully learn from the mistakes made and have a smoother transition. But of course, it is an entirely new and untested mechanism. There's a lot of things that both kind of operationally, but also kind of in the design of the policy that need to be done to get it right. From our point of view, I believe, I cannot say with certainty, but I believe that the EU steel industry is supportive broadly of the kind of the framework, but I think they also have concerns with certain specific elements which we share. I mean, from the UK point of view, given that the EU is going ahead with it, there was almost not very much option, because we don't want to be exposed to the trade diversion of all the high emission steel that's not going to the EU because there's a cost, and then it's coming to the UK instead. So purely just with how our markets are interconnected, and also kind of geographically, we'd be very exposed to trade diversion, and therefore the UK steel industry does very much see a role for a robust carbon leakage measure. I don't know whether CBAM would have necessarily been the first choice if it hadn't been for what the kind of the route that the EU took, but given that that's the direction of travel now, I think that's kind of where we're going. And if anything, we're worried that ours is coming in too late in 2027, which leaves that period of, again, where we're even more exposed to that kind of diversion potentially of material. I think there's definitely a role for kind of other things to consider going forward. I mean, when the UK government consulted on this, they were also asking about product standards, for example, and I know that this is something that might kind of be considered later down the line. But at the moment, we're going ahead with our CBAM. We're facing the challenges we are facing with exporting to the EU's CBAM. And I think the kind of the main things that we're concerned about at the moment, which I think also the EU industry is concerned about, is parts of the policy that I guess the policy doesn't guarantee, I suppose, carbon leakage, or that carbon leakage won't happen. So you could easily see a situation, I mean, I described earlier this kind of situation of overcapacity and oversupply in the industry. There's plenty of material to go around that can just be, the trade flows could just be reoriented. You can see, in effect, like a two-tier market globally, where all the low emissions material go to the EU and the UK, for example, but there's still a lot more high emission material that is produced and going elsewhere. So you just have a reshuffling of a resource, but no actual net reduction in emissions. So that's kind of not the purpose in that sense, but obviously from there is still the kind of need for, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it might be unfair from an exporter's point of view, but equally, as I said, I think if we were in a situation where the domestic industry was not subject to ETS costs, did not have to pay for carbon costs, then it would be a different story. But given that we have to face that additional cost, then we think it is fair that imports also face the same cost, because then we're competing on the same basis. Another concern is also, it was mentioned by Zaid earlier, you know, it'll increase costs for kind of downstream industry and for consumers. So again, we don't, well, first we don't want to damage a downstream industry, and second, you know, you could, as a, in effect, circumvention of the CBAM, you could see imports increase for the downstream products instead of the steel kind of coming in. So again, that's not, that could be an unintended consequence. Finally, also, it doesn't, from a competitiveness of the producer point of view, the CBAM doesn't address our kind of competitiveness in terms of the UK exports to other markets, because again, as I said, we face those higher costs versus our competitors. So it doesn't entirely solve the problem, but it does equalize, I guess, those the cost of carbon that we do pay. So from that point of view, we do think it's a useful mechanism. And as I said, the concern is the kind of the different timing with which the EU CBAM is coming into full implementation versus the UK one. I mean, just to briefly kind of touch upon the kind of wider protectionism that kind of you mentioned that we're seeing around the world, I think we're definitely at a point in time. I mean, CBAM is definitely, you know, from our point of view, it's not a protectionist measure. It is about that level playing field, but of course we recognize it has trade implications. But you are genuinely seeing like a significant increase in protectionism worldwide. I mean, it started with kind of US Section 232 back in 2018. You're increasingly seeing unilateral measures. I mean, Canada recently introduced just, you know, 25% tariff on steel and aluminium, not really going through the trade remedies procedure or anything like that. It just was decided. And so you're seeing that kind of shift, I guess, where increasingly there is, I guess, when some big players take measures, then it also it becomes in effect a domino, where other countries also feel like they also need to take equivalent measures, because otherwise they see the trade diversion and they're exposed. So in addition to that, you are seeing a flurry of trade remedies, which I think we'll kind of go into next. But there's a huge amount of, I mean, just in, I think in August alone, there was like multiple cases launched on hot rolled coil from like the EU on multiple countries, then all these countries launched cases against each other. So like we are generally seeing that kind of rise in, well, in domestic industries, I guess, kind of looking to protect themselves, but also at a time when there is all this kind of massive transition to decarbonize. So it's a complex, I guess, global environment that we find ourselves in. And yeah, I guess I'll kind of leave it at, you know, there's a lot of challenges. We still have to remain competitive, but also, as I said, there is a worry that it's difficult to get out of that vicious circle of more protectionism as the kind of big players are heading that way. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Chrysa. You also mentioned subsidy investigations, so I will pick up from there and would like to turn to Bülent Bey now. Thank you for your patience. We had enough talk of CBAM. I think now let's turn a bit on the subsidization world in general. You're advising companies on many aspects of trade policy, but also on trade remedy investigations. In trade remedy investigations, you're assisting them. It's a fact that governments are now relying heavily on incentives to decarbonize all sectors of the economy, which is very normal. Can you elaborate a little bit about the general landscape of subsidization of all sectors of the economy? And can you elaborate and how these mechanisms are addressed within the context of trade remedy investigations? Do you believe that current trade policies, particularly the application of trade remedies, align with these decarbonization efforts?
Thank you, Ayşegül Hanım, and again, thanks IMMİB for inviting me to this forum. As everybody mentioned, there are very important and ambitious steps taken by especially developed countries towards decarbonization. Zaid mentioned the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very ambitious and bold policy, which is expected to attract billions of dollars towards a greener economy. The U.S. Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act authorized nearly $19 billion to fund new and existing electrical vehicle-related programs. And EU likewise has a large mechanism in place. Most recently, European Investment Bank is expected to mobilize more than 150 billion euros. These are all good developments as a world citizen towards decarbonization. I mean, it's good to see finally actions are being taken, but the rising protectionism makes, unfortunately, no exceptions, not even to products which would help actually decarbonization. I'll give you a few examples. Some of the world's largest trade cases targeted imports of solar panels, for example. Very famously, the United States has now in place about 7 different trade policy measures: anti-dumping, subsidy, Section 201, safeguards, Section 301 against China, the Uyghur Protection Act. And according to some studies I've seen, these tariffs are estimated to raise the prices of solar panels between 90 to 290%. Although now terminated, the EU also has applied anti-dumping measures against solar panels for more than 5 years. And both the US and EU naturally are huge importers of solar panels. These affected billions of dollars of trade in solar panel imports. And again, now we're reading that the EU industry is lobbying for a new trade remedy measure, again targeting solar panels. In addition to the solar panels, the US, EU, and Canada have very aggressive trade remedy measures for another important green energy product, which are the steel wind towers. US has anti-dumping and CVDs, anti-subsidy measures against 9 countries dating back to 2013. And EU imposed anti-dumping measures against China on the same product 3 years ago. And most recently, we've all heard that US and Canada imposed 100% tariffs on electrical vehicles from China. Of course, you know, issues with China are never just trade. There are broader implications, but you know, electrical vehicles are seen as an important tool to reduce carbon emissions. And there are now 100% tariffs on electrical vehicles in US and Canada. In EU, there's an ongoing anti-subsidy investigation also against electrical vehicles from China. And these are all on top of Section 232 measures against aluminum and steel in the US, which are actually covering a lot of products key in the development of green technologies. In addition to this, there's yet another way the trade remedy investigations are currently being used to seriously hinder and damage the decarbonization efforts. We talked about government policies and incentives to reduce emissions and renewable energy transformations. But these very same policies are heavily penalized in anti-subsidy investigations without any distinction of the intent or the product. For example, there's currently an ongoing anti-subsidy investigation in the US against Canadian lumber. The US Department of Commerce is investigating and probably will potentially impose duties on 17 federal and provincial climate change-related programs. So anything, if it confers a benefit, regardless of the intent, is being investigated and will likely turn into a tariff in the US. Steel and aluminum exporters, which is, a large majority of our clients are steel and aluminum exporters. They're all under heavy pressure now to reduce carbon emissions. But these exporters are also the most frequent targets of trade remedy cases. Any participation of these exporters in the local government programs to reduce emissions has the potential to come back at them as very hefty trade remedy duties. For example, these programs include production and procurement of energy generated from renewable energy sources, the grants provided for projects aiming energy efficiency, and so on. For example, in Turkey, where most of our clients are, there's a program that are investigated. Steel companies have invested in green energies, and they're selling it to the government at a price predetermined. And US is investigating this because that price is too high. And if the price is higher than the current electricity prices, that's considered a subsidy. And also the Turkish steel industry's access to many investment incentives has already been very restricted since the 90s because Turkey is as part of the European Coal and Steel Community Agreement. And the exporters are simply put in an impossible position. So if they use, as everybody mentioned, these are capital-intensive projects. So if they use government programs, subsidies to decarbonize, that comes back at them as subsidy or dumping duties. But if they don't use and remain at the current carbon emission levels, then they would have to pay the carbon border adjustment taxes. Now, go figure. Granted, the trade remedy laws are not designed to make any distinctions. They don't have to look at the purpose of a subsidy, or they don't have to look at the product that are being investigated. Solar panel is just like another product. But I think this dilemma has to be addressed and resolved. Basically, what governments are giving with one hand, they're taking with the other. In 2014, 18 participants representing close to 50 members at the WTO launched negotiations to reduce tariffs on environmental goods. Unfortunately, in 2016, you'll recall these talks have collapsed. And the fundamental problem there was the negotiators couldn't reach an agreement on what constitutes an environmental good. To me, the answer is simple, but it didn't work. So there are now talks with the Harris administration in the US. If that happens, these talks may resume. I would love to see that happen, actually, and perhaps trade remedy measures can also be addressed as part of those negotiations, and some of these issues can be revisited.
Thank you very much. Very interesting dilemma that you pointed out. I think we have a similar trend in the dispute settlement mechanism as well since 2010. There has been nearly 10 cases involving renewable energy subsidies, whereas there have been in fossil fuels. What you said about investigations are also particularly interesting, and I think it shows that the SEM agreement suffers from a green policy space deficit, which it had originally for a limited period of time. But it now stands as an obstacle to our green transition. And thank you for this, which I believe it is something directly falling under the work of the WTO, and some members have already are trying to get into work in this area as well. So now let's turn to our final round. We have, I think, 15 minutes left. In this final round, I would like to ask our panelists to reflect on whether carbon border adjustments will serve its intended purpose in the longer run. Chrysa, you mentioned that it might not even prevent carbon leakage. And secondly, how trade and international cooperation can help these sectors to transition to low carbon, especially in developing countries. So I would like to first go with Bülent Bey and then turn to Yavuz Bey, and I would like to ask all the panelists to, if they wish so, to react to what they have heard so far, and then we will move to questions and answers.
Okay, it's me again. So yes, the CBAM, on the face of it, has a simple and a very noble goal. It is intended to level the playing field between local and foreign producers and promote either similar carbon trading schemes or a reduction in carbon emissions. But I'd like to go back to trade remedy measures. Initially, they also had a very grand and noble goal. Both the anti-dumping and subsidy were initially created to address unfair trade practices. And for a while it worked. Back in the 80s, Japan was the China then. They had very protected local markets, and they were making huge profits in the domestic market and basically using those profits to dump, export huge quantities to world markets just to contribute to their overhead costs. Also there were a lot of direct cash payment subsidies directly promoting exports. These trade remedy measures to a large extent address that. But especially in the last 10, 12 years, we're seeing a significant shift in the application of these tools. Every US administration since Bill Clinton has made the application of trade remedy tools more hostile towards exporters. You know, we used to look forward to actually, from a trade standpoint, a Republican administration because they used to be more free trade. Now the Republicans are even more protectionist than the Democrats. What I want to give some examples of how the trade remedy measures has shifted from a simple goal towards more basically abused, if I may say, to just create high margins and high tariffs for countries. US has been applying a policy called zeroing, which would offset negative dumping with the positive, which would cause actually lower tariffs. That was actually overturned by WTO, but US has now used a backdoor in the terms of a statistical testing and finds still very high margins. Most countries now are invented a specific provision in the anti-dumping agreement called PMS, particular market situation. Anything, any simple thing can be used as an excuse to disregard the actual figures of the exporters and producers. And there are some ridiculous subsidy programs being invented. So my concern basically is exactly this happening to CBAM. I mean, it's still the early days, and I guess many modifications will have to be made. But I fear every such modification will make it harder for exporters to report the real emissions, and it's going to be overstated. Eurofer, the European Steel Association, already started criticizing CBAM, probably trying to pave way to lobbying to make it difficult for exporters. And I'll want to give you another example. Chrysa mentioned that the electric arc furnace technology is using scrap as an input is a much better technology to produce steel to reduce the carbon emissions. Turkey is one of the largest producers using electric arc furnace technology, and last year Eurofer, the European Steel Producers Association, advocated a total export ban on scrap. I mean, it fortunately got rejected, but from a policy standpoint, I guess the governments to prevent this from becoming just another protectionist tool, they used to make all of the climate-related trade policies consistent with each other. You know, this includes the treatment of subsidies, as I mentioned, but any efforts like this, like a scrap ban or other things, should also be considered in totality beyond CBAM to prevent this from becoming another protectionist tool.
Thank you very much. Yavuz Bey.
Since we are here in the World Trade Organization building, I would like to talk a little bit about how trade can help companies like ASSAN Alüminyum to achieve their sustainability goals, as well as their other goals like making profits. We import most of our raw material imports, and we export about 75% of our production. Therefore, free and fair trade is not a nice-to-have issue for us. It's an existential issue. And with some dismay, we are observing that over the last 8 years or so, access to raw material markets and access to downstream markets, our product markets, is being curtailed for very reasonable reasons, understandable reasons, national security, fair trade, sustainability, but at the end, we are finding it more and more difficult to act in a responsible way and to be continue to be a going concern, economical, commercial concern. And I think multilateral organizations like World Trade Organization has a very important role to ensure the level playing field, increasingly so for sustainability as well. But on the other hand, they need to remain viable as a viable forum to solve these issues. For example, US and European Union have been talking for some years now about an agreement called Global Agreement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminium, which aims to address both excess market capacity issues and sustainability issues at the same time. So, you know, it takes two very difficult problems and combines it into even more difficult problem. And personally, I have concerns that unless WTO and other organizations become much more forceful in taking the lead, such bilateral solutions will become more prevalent.
Thank you very much. Yes, I agree. WTO has a lot to prevent CBAM or other kind of trade measures not to turn into some kind of protectionism or not lead to further fragmentation in international trade. Thank you all for your reflections. It has been very enlightening. There's a lot of food for thought. And now I would like to turn to our audience. We have 5 minutes left. Does anybody like to raise any question to our panelists? Yes, sir. I see a hand over there. Could you please introduce yourself and your affiliation? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I am Chrysa Glystra. I head the Center for WTO Studies, which is a department earnings. My quick question on the UK CBAM and CBAM in general is that I was very glad to hear that somebody actually said it's basically to ensure that the domestic industry does not suffer, because the narrative has been it's about the greater good of mankind. So I'm glad that there is some honesty in that sense. But in that perspective, one quick question is that, ETS, the price of carbon will be different across different countries. Which means, from an equalization levy, one can understand that, but in terms of achieving the carbon target, this is not doesn't seem to be the most efficient measure. So your thoughts on that. Second, on the downstream industries, given the nature of the kind of manufacturing that we have, you have a lot of blending of materials, a lot of composites, etc. And the rules are not very clear on that. If I'm a user of downstream materials of these industries, what compliance I have to do, what's the reporting mechanism? And many of the players in that segment, at least in the country I come from, are MSMEs, which is, the cost of compliance will be so significantly high that they completely priced out of the market. So your thoughts on that, please. Thank you very much.
Chrysa, would you like to respond?
Yes, can I just clarify, was the first question whether ETS is a kind of helpful in reducing, or as an incentive to decarbonize?
Yeah,
is that the question?
So the ETS obviously is a very good measure, and like Turkey, India is also coming up with this. It's a work in progress. But the price of carbon that the ETS will ascribe in every country's ETS will be different. But the offsetting, of course, will have to be vis-a-vis the price of the EU or the UK ETS in that context. So in that sense, it seems it's not an efficient measure to decarbonize. It is purely an equalization levy, as we call it at the border. So, whatever additional expenditure a British firm would have to pay, you're imposing that on the foreign firm. So it's not, it has nothing to do with mitigation of carbon. It has everything to do with equalization levy. Would you agree with that statement?
So I guess, I just want to start by saying that, obviously, we are in, I guess I'll start from the ETS point. I think you can question whether, for industry having to pay ETS costs for all these years, whether it has helped or incentivized industry to decarbonize, because arguably, because decarbonization doesn't happen incrementally for steel making, and I imagine for aluminium as well, it's not like, you gradually decarbonize and then you gradually have to pay less in terms of your ETS costs. It's a step change. So you emit this much and you make a massive investment and then you emit considerably less. So it doesn't, because of the nature of the industry, if anything, you could make the argument that all this money that's been paid in ETS all these years could have gone in the investment to decarbonize the industry. Instead, it sort of, adds pressure to the already low kind of margin environment that we operate in. But look, I'm not going to question whether, when ETS was set up as to, how it was done and whether it was right or wrong. I think we are at a point now where there's no question of, governments in the UK or the EU removing carbon costs. And so given that we have to face these costs, then, we think it's fair that imports also face the costs. It has encouraged, I think, some wider thinking, obviously, in countries, and okay, the UK is a relatively small market in the scheme of things, but certainly the EU is a big market, and I think, there's more talk of decarbonisation and of lowering emissions and perhaps speeding it up in kind of countries that do see Europe as a key market. So, I wouldn't want to discount it completely, but from having somewhat a noble kind of intention as well. But certainly from like a producer's point of view, 2/3 of steel making capacity is in countries that either have a carbon neutrality target for 2060 or later. So it doesn't quite add up. China is still looking to reach peak carbon in 2030. They still intend to continue kind of expanding, increasing emissions. I mean, India, obviously, with kind of how its capacity is going, will be doubling its emissions by 2030. So I think, in a way, the way things are at the moment, we need that kind of carbon leakage, and there isn't another option. I mean, I cannot comment that much in terms of, I appreciate it gets complex the more you get into downstream products. And obviously our system kind of is not, like the details of it and how exactly that's going to be done has not been fully decided and published and kind of implemented, kind of, so to speak. So I think it will remain to be seen. I think from our point of view, you would eventually have to expand the CBAM to cover the downstream products as well, so that you don't just end up having the kind of substitution of imports into these products. But of course, we'd have to think carefully of how that is designed.
Thank you very much. I think we are out of our time, but if there is anybody that can ask a question and thinks that they can receive a response in 1 minute, maybe we can also accommodate that. I think there is none. So I would like to thank you all for being with us here today, and I would like to thank to my panel for this very extensive discussion. And I would ask you to give them a round of applause. Thank you very much, and a very good day to you all.